hay por aquí? Cuéntame, ¿qué me vas a decir?
Welcome, listener. Bienvenido, oyente, to episode number 8. I am Yesenia Chavez con mi amigo
Jaime Mallorquin, and once again we'll be serving as your hosts, your guides, your cuento curators for this Latino, Latina, Latina storytelling podcast. ¿Qué me cuentas?
¿Qué me cuentas tú?
Hola, amigas, amigos, y enemigos también. Hello to you also. This episode skews a bit more bilingual than we've typically gone before, and I guess I'd apologize here if we weren't an unapologetically bilingual podcast. But we are. Así que si no les gusta, pues ni modo. Don't worry though, there is definitely enough here for everyone to enjoy.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're like usual feeling very eager to share these stories that we collected for you because our main purpose for creating this platform was to give a voice to those in our community who often feel voiceless.
And for this reason, this episode's theme is Sin Documentos, stories around the experience of being undocumented in this country.
The theme was inspired by a story submission we received several months back, but also, I mean, we both have people in our lives that we love who once were or are still today considered undocumented.
My parents came to the U.S. in the late 70s, early 80s from Chihuahua, Mexico. They crossed the border in Texas, and they never really talked about their experiences until we got older. And the only thing I do remember is them talking about some immigration raids that would happen and how sometimes they had to hide or run to not get taken away by La Migra. Then later, they both were able to get their citizenship, and it wasn't really something that we had to worry about. And I know that I'm very blessed and fortunate to have had that experience.
You know, I think it was also the same for my parents. I believe they outstayed their work visas, and then amnesty in the mid-'80s sort of took care of it for them. And as a citizen born here, I can't really speak on it and pretend to understand what being undocumented must feel like.
I agree, and that's why the art that so many undocumented playwrights, poets, cuentistas, and filmmakers are creating is so important. Our first cuentista is a very inspiring screenwriter, actor, director, and producer of his very own web series. He shares his frustration with feeling restrained, feeling voiceless at work because of his immigration status. Here is Armando Ibanez with A Taste of Freedom.
It's hard to find a job out there without a social security number. When you're undocumented, no matter how much you might hate a job, you know you have to make bigger sacrifices, like not speaking up when you really want to. I started working in the restaurant industry when I first arrived in this country. I was 18 years old. And at that same age, I also started going to adult school at night to learn English. I have worked many different positions in the restaurant industry: dishwasher, cook, cashier, etc. And as I continued learning English, I was moving up in positions. Eventually, I became a server, and I have been serving tables since then. It's been 20 years. Please don't do the math. When you're serving tables as a Mexican undocumented immigrant with an accent, it's so frustrating. You have to deal with a lot of stupid shit customers say or do to you. One time, I had this white boy who was on a date. At the end of the meal, he asked me to put his leftovers into go boxes. I took the plates and put the leftovers in a box. When I brought out the boxes and put them on his table, he grabbed my hand and told me, "Hey amigo, the food is actually for you. Muchas gracias," and hands me the boxes. I was shocked. I went to the kitchen and threw the boxes away. I felt something I had never felt before. I was so upset. I couldn't explain why. Sometimes customers talk to you as if you were stupid, como si estuvieras bien pendejo. Sometimes white people talk to you with one or two words in Spanish. The one I hate the most is very common. It's gracias, señor. Not señor, señor. I once had a lady who asked me for the name of the salsa song playing at the moment. I replied, I didn't know the song. She said, really? What kind of Mexican are you? You know, porque en su cabeza de ellos, un mexicano se debe saber todas las canciones de salsa o todas las canciones en español. And now and then, customers will make comments about your accent. Things like, I don't understand your English, or they will only talk to the white staff and assume I'm just the busboy. Lo odio. It really affects you. You feel frustrated and upset. It's as if you have no voice and you never get to say what you would truly want to say to these awful people. Well, I shouldn't say never. At a casual fancy restaurant, we used to have this regular customer, a guy in his mid-40s. None of the staff wanted to serve him. He was rude, impolite, would never tip, and would always complain. He would talk to me in a condescending way, as if I didn't speak English. Nada nuevo. He would speak to me slowly and loudly. It was insulting. One time he said, I'm not leaving a tip because the service took a long time. Mind you, the restaurant was busy as fuck, and he wanted to be treated like Queen Elizabeth. I wanted to tell him so many things, but I never could. I didn't want to lose my job. He would visit once a week, and no matter what we did, he would always complain. I just wish he had stopped coming to the restaurant. He once ordered a cocktail, and when I brought the drink to him, he replied, Didn't you understand what I said? Why is the service always the same? I asked what was wrong with the drink. I apologized and offered to make him a new cocktail. He ignored me as always. Weeks later, on a busy Saturday night, he showed up again with a group of friends. I walked to his table and took his order. He was being rude as always. At the end of the night, he asked for separate checks and complained about the drinks being so expensive, por supuesto, como siempre. But this time, I felt different. I took a moment to respond. I looked at him and I said, You know what? If the service is so bad and the drinks are so expensive, why do you always keep coming here? Don't you know we all hate you? Nobody wants to serve you here. You're so fucking annoying. And if you want to complain to the manager, go ahead and do it. I don't care. He looked at me speechless. His friends seemed amazed, as if they enjoyed what I had just done. I walked away from the table feeling like I was flying. Unfortunately, for that annoying customer, a couple weeks before, the owner had informed us that the restaurant was going out of business. And that Saturday was actually the last day of work for us. The restaurant was closing for good. Without consequences holding me back, I was finally able to speak to him like I wish I could speak to all rude customers. As I said before, being undocumented, sometimes you cannot really speak up in situations where you feel people treat you like less than. That night, I really think the universe rewarded me with a gift. I felt unstoppable. I felt free, libre. I wish I could feel like that all the time.
Very well done, Armando. I'm sure many of us can relate to aspects of his story, especially if you've worked with customers or with the public. But when you add on the uncertainty of finding another job because of your immigration status, it must make so many people feel powerless. But Armando refused to keep himself in this voiceless, powerless place. In his web series, Undocumented Tales, which you can stream on YouTube, he's giving voice to his experience as a server, as a queer undocumented man, and just as a human being. I'm truly a fan of his series, and a couple summers ago, I got to volunteer as a PA on his set, and it was an emotional, hopeful experience seeing all the young Latina faces in front of and behind the camera. I've always dreamed of this being the future for us because there's so many of us in Los Angeles, but not so many in important roles in the film industry. Several years back, I worked as a TA for the film and TV production classes at my high school after I graduated, and it was mostly Latinx students doing everything. And the reason I'm bringing this up is to segue to our next storyteller. She was one of the students I worked with. This is Yajaira Calderon con su cuento, Not in the System.
On Valentine's Day 2009, I went to Guitar Center in Cerritos, California, ready to use my tax refund on an amp trading as a present to myself. I was soliciting advice via text message from my brother, who was 600 miles to the north, when suddenly two sheriffs slowly approached me, one from the front and one from behind, like I was some dangerous animal that had wandered in from the wild. I only became aware of them when I felt the cold cuffs on my wrists. The male sheriff took away my phone, and I watched him read my brother's texts. It really did not help my case, whatever my case was, that my brother has always enjoyed calling me chola and thug to poke fun of how unchola and unthug I truly am. Meanwhile, the lady sheriff handcuffed me from behind, whispering, "Don't make a scene." But the scene was already made. Nearby patrons stopped testing out gear and were staring. The manager and the employee who had been helping me, or so I thought, were standing by the door watching me get escorted out. And I was crying with snot and everything, trying to hide my face behind my long, loose hair. I immediately imagined myself being sent back to Mexico, being stranded on the side of the road somewhere until someone took pity on me, or until they decided to try a little rape and murder that day. I don't remember having been read my rights, but it didn't matter to me then because as a non-American citizen, I didn't believe I had rights. In all honesty, I sometimes still doubt that I do. So I did not resist and I asked no questions. They put me in the police car and I sat there waiting to be told what was going to happen. The lady sheriff told her colleague that I was being booked for possession of a false identification card. At the time, all I could get, was a matrícula consular issued by the Mexican consulate that was rejected nearly everywhere I tried to use it. Many going to the club nights with friends had to be canceled because of it. Not to mention, it was sort of embarrassing to flash around. The card is in the colors of the Mexican flag, and if it isn't the biggest "I'm living illegally in the U.S." document, I don't know what is. So a few weeks after obtaining this card, I went down to a sketchy alley on Pacific Boulevard in Huntington Park to get a fake ID from a guy who, like me, was just doing what he could to survive. The ID was as fake as they come, but it had all my actual information from the matricula, so I felt naively safe having it. That purchase was my first mistake. Showing it to the Guitar Center sales guy when he asked for it to verify eligibility was a second. But how was I to know that instead of rejecting me and sending me on my way like the club bouncers did, they would call the authorities? On the drive to jail, against the advice of every legal show I'd ever watched, I began to answer questions. "How did you learn to speak English so well?" the male sheriff asked me. Between tears, I told him that I had been living in LA since I was a child and I naturally learned it in school. "Good," he replied, with an approving tone for my ability to communicate in their language. The car pulled into the station, then left after dropping me and the lady sheriff off inside the gated premises. She escorted me into the building and handed a paper and a plastic bag holding my few possessions to a clerk that met us by the entrance. Then the sheriff held me up against the wall and told me to spread them. She sounded angry, as if being there having to frisk me was an inconvenience for her. "Ma'am, I had other plans that day too." "Take off your sweater," she ordered. I was wearing a zippered hoodie, a thermal shirt under a polo, and jeans. "Now take off your shirt," she said. I hesitated. She made a face and snapped her fingers, so I removed my shirt, but she still wanted more. She patted me over to the thermal, then asked me to take it off. I felt like a cheap stripper, giving it away for free. She threw my clothes back to me and told me to get dressed. I did. She walked me over to a glass cell. I felt like an animal on display, soon to be a fish in a bowl, once all my tears flooded the small glass box. "Do you want to make your phone call?" said a voice to my left. The clerk was holding up a coin and speaking to me through a small opening next to the door. I shook my head no. My mind was coming up empty. Thanks a bunch, cell phones. She asked me a few more standard questions. Full name, address, where I was born, where I worked, etc. I answered everything 110% truthfully because I am a terrible liar, especially when in distress. At no point did it cross my mind that I was perhaps making my case worse. I was outing myself as an undocumented immigrant, working illegally, and telling them where I worked. She then took me out of the cage to take my prints and photos, now with that warning me that I better not try anything. I've never seen my mugshot, but if it shows red bloodshot eyes, I wasn't drunk. It was the crying. When she put me back in the cell, I cried with a little more fervor. It was official. I was in the system. I went to some real dark places in my head that day, places not entirely foreign to me. The shame and sometimes loathing of my nationality I was familiar with, but they had been dormant for some time because I had been living a seemingly regular life. That was my third mistake, I thought. I got too comfortable, lost in the illusion that I had somehow been made a member of the country without any official certification and ceremony. For the rest of my time in the cell, I continued to cry until I couldn't. "Ma'am," the clerk called out to me several hours later. I stood up immediately. My heart beat fast and started doing that thing where you try to climb up to my throat to sneak a listen. "We're going to let you go, but I'm going to give you a citation for a court appearance." A miracle had clearly happened. She opened the door and I stepped out quickly. She handed me my possessions and walked me to the exit. The closer we got to the door, the harder it was to breathe. I longed for the open, fresh air. I wanted to get as far away as possible from there in case someone would realize that a mistake had been made and put me back in. But I also have expected immigration to be standing outside the door. Once outside, I took a breath so deep that I thought I was going to choke. I turned on my phone and I dialed my brother. "Sup, Chola," he answered. Oh, that was so not funny. The sound of his voice made me cry again, hard. I could hear merriment in the background and I was homesick for that home that no longer existed, not since we left the decades before. I spent the rest of the week in bed. Perhaps a little overdramatic, but getting in trouble really threw a wrench in my emotional and mental gears. I had never even gotten El Cinto as a kid, unlike my 3 rebellious siblings. 3 months later, I had the court appointment. I stood in the long line outside the courthouse waiting for it to open, only to be told that I was not in the system. The clerk gave me the number for the DA's office and told me to call and find out when my case would be seen. I called several times a week for the next several years, and every time I was told that I was not in the system. Maybe it was an elaborate way to warn people not to even try, thinking that they were allowed to do simple, everyday things that were only reserved for legal citizens. Maybe it was just a nightmare. One that pushed me back into my personal prison, back into the shadows of society. It wasn't until DACA that I was able to come back up for air and hope. And now, thanks to DACA, I have a state-issued ID, recently renewed for a real ID. I get it, America, the real deal. That I have been asked for and shown fewer times than I ever did when I didn't have it. Which is still more times than I've been back to Guitar Center ever since.
Jahaira, wow, I can't believe this is so crazy that you had to go through all of this crap. And one of the things that really upsets me about this story, there's a lot of things, but why in the hell would a Guitar Center employee feel that they needed to call the cops on her? That was my first thought. And I definitely will not go to Guitar Center in Cerritos ever myself either.
It is very upsetting to hear that this happened to her. She was pretty shy back when I knew her. A straight-A student and definitely a rule follower. The last person I'd ever expect to be arrested. As it got closer to her graduation, I remember her friends speaking about their plans to go off to college and her sharing her frustration with me about receiving a scholarship that she wouldn't be able to use because of her undocumented status.
And unfortunately, it's a pretty common occurrence. I think back to my own high school graduation and I was so excited and I felt so hopeful, never stopping to think that this isn't how everyone walking down that stage is feeling. Our next contributor I met in my writing group at Alegria magazine, and he does an awesome job capturing what high school graduation felt like for him as an undocumented Costa Rican immigrant. Here is Jean-Pierre Rueda con su poema Desde la Cumbre de Junio.
Me dolió pensarme, bajo vestigios de sueños ajenos, percibiendo ese discurso anhelante de maestros y estudiantes, mirando todas esas caras ilusionadas, alegres, jóvenes, confiadas, sonriéndole al futuro desde la cumbre de junio en esa tarde de graduación de secundaria, sin mostrar en lágrimas cualquier indicio de tristeza. Yo escuchaba todos esos aplausos descendiendo en marejadas desde las gradas, estrellándose en el orgullo prestado vestido con birrete y diploma. Me moría de miedo al pensar que abandonaría mi identidad de estudiante para revelarme ante el mundo como inmigrante, preguntándome si los logros no avanzarían más allá de buenas calificaciones por la ausencia de pasaportes y visas de trabajo. Entre tanta alegría, yo me disolvía en aquel monumental evento, imaginándome todas esas profesiones y oportunidades que nunca llegarían a ser en mí. El corazón no sabía reaccionar. Se ocultaba hasta el punto de perderlo en esa ceremonia de graduación. Pero la risa de mis amigos, el corazón de mi novia, los ojos de mi mamá, las palabras de mi tío, me obligaron a recoger todos esos pedazos de mi ser que caían por sentir miedo. Y en ese pánico entendí entonces que lo incierto también es parte de la vida y que las dificultades realmente son la lluvia que hace retoñar esperanza cuando el tiempo es árido.
Jean-Pierre has a really beautiful voice and his delivery is always on point. He is a true poet inside and out, and I really love listening to him sharing his pieces, even if I have to have a thesaurus or dictionary on hand sometimes. But the emotion comes through, and I love listening to the Spanish. The way that things are delivered in Spanish sound so different than when they are delivered in English. There's something about it that feels like more like home. We asked him to tell us a little bit about what it was like writing his poem and how being undocumented has influenced him as a writer. Here's what he shared.
I have to confess that writing this poem has taken me more than 10 years. Every time I would start describing how it felt to live undocumented, the heart would lead me straight to this afternoon in June during my high school graduation, and my verse would cramp out of the pain of remembering such anxiety. You see, what no one tells you is the amount of apprehension, fear, and depression swelling the heart of a kid sin papeles when they are constantly asked what comes next, because high school graduations are meant to be filled with pride, joy, and hope, all the things that felt dependent on my immigration status. Just imagine unboxing all those dreams you had, taking apart all the countries you wanted to visit, unraveling your aspirations of a profession because you lacked a piece of paper stating where you lived and where you came from. I remember listening to my friends and how their future included traveling, saying San Diego sin miedo, enlisting in the Air Force, starting a business, and taking a year off to figure themselves out. I had to learn to wrinkle a smile when asked about my plans, dress them up with places I couldn't visit, sending applications to colleges I could never afford, and pretending I didn't know my social security number because I didn't remember it, not because I didn't have one. I hated lying to myself, pretending I wasn't afraid of the future and terrified of being deported. And that's where poetry came to change my life. Writing about those emotions, shaping my anxiety, and saying out loud that life is bigger than one's fears showed me the clarity I needed to calibrate my reality, a chance to connect with my pain and give it purpose. Now that I am years from that afternoon in June, with a career in banking, 2 published poetry books, and a family of my own, I can tell my younger self that my mom never lied when she said I could chase my dreams sin papeles, and that my wife was right when she told me to keep writing because there is beauty in those uncertain times and purpose in what once was feared.
I think it's such a great piece. He really takes us there to that time and place and all those feelings with just a few words. I'm definitely no expert, but I guess that's the purpose of poetry. That's what it can do. And if you're a fan of good poetry and poetry in Spanish, on Instagram I believe his name is Poeta Tico, and he's got a new poetry book out with the title Herencias. The next storyteller is one of those people so special to me that I would feel the podcast was incomplete without her voice in at least one episode. She is so many things: a playwright, a college professor, a therapist, a quilter, and for us, she is reluctantly a cuentista. Les presento a Mercedes Flores Islas compartiendo su cuento, una aquí y la otra allá.
Esto no se me olvida. I was 14 years old when I got on a train with my mom to come to El Norte, de Mojadas. Sitting on that train, hating my fate. Somehow I knew that at least one of us would never go back. 6 months earlier, my mom was sent back to Guadalajara against her will. 2 years before that, she had come to the U.S. and got a job working as a living nanny and maid for a Mexican family. It wasn't much of a job, really, porque le cobraban por todo. Ropa, food, detergent, toiletries, rent, y pues nomás le quedaba about $50 a week. And most of that she sent home for my siblings and me. Pobrecita, she was working like a single mother. But little by little, she learned ways to maximize her money. And she learned that she could make a lot more money working as a bar hostess. All she had to do was look beautiful and entice clients to spend as much money as they could. She was 32, beautiful, and charming. She had never experienced this type of freedom before. Ella se escapó con mi papá. No tenía ni 15. 3 kids, and 14 years later, cuando mi papá nos dejó, with nothing but a first-grade education and a huge fantasy that a man could fix all her problems, it wasn't enough, so she had to go to El Norte, a trabajar. Her journey to America had been very traumatic, so she never intended to send for us. My brother, though, a mama's boy, decided to join her a year later. By then, she had a boyfriend. He was a decent man. Un hombre de familia, Mama would say. But now that she had a 17-year-old son with her, drinking for a living was not acceptable for this man. And since I was her only excuse for needing to make that kind of money, one day my mom woke up to find out that her bags had been packed and that her plane ticket had been bought. She was sent home to bring me with her to the U.S. I remember the day she returned, so unexpectedly. She was wearing all kinds of joyas, gold chains, a golden heart, una placa con su nombre en oro. They were presents from her clients. The neighbors came over the moment they heard she was back. En ese tiempo se decía that if one makes it to El Norte, nomás se regresan los huevones y los pendejos. ¿Por qué te veniste? They'll ask. Pues por mi hija. She refused to be either. And she didn't even ask me how it was. As time passed, se hizo obvio. Her boyfriend had never intended to help her get back to El Norte. She had always been abusive, pero ahora se desquitaba conmigo. She was beating me even more, and she was doing it in front of anyone. Parecía que traía el demonio por dentro, comiéndose whatever was left of her heart. All that lived inside of this woman was just this obsession, El Norte. She finally seduced a former client to help her, and she sold her joyas to get us train tickets. The idea of being without my mom again had once been so painful, pero ahora, all I wanted was to get away from her. But I was there. Every time my sister ran away, holding my mom's hand, walking to the end of the world looking for her. No hay peor cosa que ver una madre buscando a una hija perdida. Silly me. En ese tiempo, yo creí que me quería igual. So I swallowed the bullet, and on October 3rd, 1987, I got on el tren bala with my mom. 2 days later, my mom called her new boyfriend from a hotel lobby in Tijuana. Ya llegamos. Amos. He wasn't expecting me. The coyote he hired never arrived, and instead, a coyote assistant attempting to steal us when the first coyote came to get us. He took us to a house in Tecate and made us wait in a room full of pollos, as they called us. Around noon llegaron los real coyotes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco. They pointed at our heads and took us in groups of 5. Or Coyote took us to a plaza and brought us nieves. I don't even remember the flavor I got porque de repente he said, vamos, vamos, vamos. And we ditched our ice cream and we jumped through a hole in the fence and we ran through the tall grass until we found a car with all the doors open. We piled in, one on top of the other. My mom sat in the front seat pretending to be the Coyote's wife. She put her arm around him, and every time La Migra passed by, she let out this fake laugh como si nada. We waited in San Diego until it was dark. Then we got on a plane to LAX. When we arrived to LA, my mom could not get a hold of her new boyfriend, but she knew his address in Boyle Heights. On our way there, we stopped at a lonchera on Boyle and First, right after midnight. While my mom ordered the food for us, oh, I took in the glorious downtown skyline. Then she handed me my first burrito. "Pa tus 15," she laughed. It was my 15th birthday. My mom's boyfriend was a lot younger than her, and thank God he let us in. I was enrolled in school almost immediately, and from that moment on, I lived with that pressure of my mom's hope to marry me off and be done with me. Every boy I ever spoke to had to be vetted. "Tiene papeles?" she'd ask. If he didn't, I had to stop talking to him. Years later, I was finally able to believe that I could do it on my own. So I wanted to move in with my best friend, Joanna. Then my mom started calling me a lesbiana con tanto desprecio. I didn't know how to deal with it, so I literally married the first man I found. He was very abusive, and thanks to him, I qualified for Violence Against Women Act. But that's another cuento. Just recently I learned that last October, my mom went back to Mexico. Hadn't seen or spoken to her for many years. Last year, she got COVID and she got so sick she thought she was going to die, so she called my siblings, said goodbye to them. She wouldn't speak to me or my children. And even after that, a part of me still harbored this stupid hope that one day we could be somehow okay with each other. And now that she left y me dejó, me siento como que esa bullet that I swallowed so long ago, that had been lodged somewhere where hope lies, it has finally exploded. And it destroyed toda esa maldita esperanza que tenía. I guess this is what it would have felt like had she never come back for me, or if I had run away. Una aquí y la otra allá.
Mercedes, one of the things that struck me the most was your own strength in navigating this difficult situation as a woman, as an undocumented woman, as a daughter, as a mother. There's so much there.
That part about eating her first burrito at a lonchera past midnight on her 15th birthday while taking in the downtown LA skyline at night from First and Boyle, it was at the same time tragic and silly and beautiful to me.
Definitely, Jaime. There is something very beautiful about that scene, and that's something that struck me about all of the stories, the beauty in the mundane and these little small acts of resistance, of courage, of resilience. And it reminds me that, you don't know what people are dealing with. So why don't you just not be an asshole and be kind? It reminded me of that. And also reminded me of all the privileges that I have as a U.S. citizen, and that maybe I should stop whining sometimes, Thank you, Cuentistas, for that. For our next episode, our theme will be Primer Impacto, stories about firsts. It can be anything. First day of school, your first time, tu primer amor, first day on the job, any first that you feel is a good story. Hit us up on Instagram or at quemecuentaspod@gmail.com with a formal pitch. We have a couple spots open for this one. The deadline for the pitch would be December 12th, el Día de la Virgencita.
Also, if you're hearing this early enough, consider getting a ticket for Arena, the House musical at Casa 0101 Theater. It's a hot ticket and it's selling out really fast. I watched it last weekend and it was a super fun show. And Marlene Luna, from a couple episodes ago, is also a cast member in it.
Like usual, we'd like to thank our storytellers for their vulnerability and for all the time that they put into putting these cuentos together with us. Our theme song is by the talented Alfredo Avila.
Thank you once again to Yesenia's cousin Omar Ramirez and the Tracks for allowing us to use their music.
Follow us on IG or FB for more info on them and our cuentistas at Que Me Cuentas Pod.
Also, we have a few new podcast reviews to shout out. Gracias a Patricia Zamorano, Sharazadeh, and Mudhoney6.
Also, don't forget to subscribe to Que Me Cuentas if you haven't already. And for Christmas, a huge present to us would be helping us get 60 5-star ratings.
This has been Que Me Cuentas. Hasta la próxima.
Feliz Navidad y feliz Año Nuevo también. Happy holidays, everyone. Stay safe.
¿Qué me cuentas tú?
Feliz Navidad, próspero año y felicidad.